Ladies and gentlemen, today we will learn and hear about monasticism. Monasticism was born out of a deep desire to fulfill the desire of the soul. It filled a religious need, and I would say it was the basis for Christianity to survive until today, and also lay an important foundation even for our unification movement. So let us start and go into it right away. I will share the screen. So what were the goals of monasticism? It was the desire of Matthew 5:48 to seek perfection. You should be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. So therefore, those ambitious people had a desire to really find out this Christ-like nature and to unite mind and body to overcome the obstacles that are like a stumbling block in our life, as Paulus lamented, and to achieve control and focus and purification and become one with God, and by this become a vessel within which God can live and so which God can work. The early church was made out of holy men and also women who withdrew from society, went to the desert, and the word monasticism comes from the Greek word monakos, which means solitary. And these solitary figures gradually gathered in community. They started out individually, but they became found other compatriots. Monasticism was like the second, or was the child that inherited the mantle of the martyrs. So after the year 400, there were no more martyrs, and the monastics took on their role in going a voluntary course in subjecting their bodies to suffering. They became the locus of sanctity in society, and Christians asked for their prayers, intercessions, donated money to monastic establishments. The beginnings of this monastic movement was in Egypt, and there were two phases. One that started as a solitary hermits, the so-called anchorites, and secondly, it developed into cenobitic communities that were like groups that organized themselves to live together. So one of the first anchorites is known as Saint Anthony the Great. He is most famous. He was born in Egypt, and Athanasius wrote a book about him, The Life of Saint Anthony. Saint Anthony was a charismatic holy man whose gifts and example inspired many to give up the world. So he was a wealthy man, and he gave up his inheritance, gave it to the poor, and retreated into the desert to live as a hermit. Anthony faced also temptations and overcome them. So what inspired him in the beginning was Jesus' words: if you want to be perfect, go sell what you have and give it to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. come, follow me. This aspect refers to an ascetic practice of early hermits who thought spiritual purification through extreme isolation, often seen as a metaphorical descent into death and darkness before achieving enlightenment. Yeah, and yeah, sorry. So many times they were faced with all kinds of obstacles, you know, rats and in different types of insects that were bothering them. He was living in a fort in the beginning, but he finally started to abandon it because he got too many visitors and too many people who brought him donations or whatever, giving him help and asking his advice. So he went into a cave by the Red Sea. And yeah, he was seeking deep isolation here. He returned to the world twice in 311 and 355. And he came back to share his wisdom with the world and give inspiration to others, and others started to follow him. So it is a painting of the trials he experienced during this time, temptations. Another person is Pachomius. He was born in the Upper Nile, and he conscripted to military service, and he met a group of Christians who inspired him so much that afterwards he sought their instruction and got baptized and decided to become a soldier of God. He withdrew into the desert, where he served for 7 years under another anchorite, and learned from him, and he joined him. He received a revelation in which he was asked to establish a xenobitic system, so to live together in this kind of life. However, it is not easy to gather anchorites to live together in a communal life, because they're very good in organizing their life individually, but when it comes to do it in groups, it's not so easy. And therefore, yeah, it was first a failure, but later it was a success. Yeah. So they lived within, they built them like, yeah, their home was surrounded by a wall, so nobody could look inside. They had to vow in obedience, and they had a hierarchy, and also distributed diverse jobs to do, not just prayer and fasting. And yeah, so their life was a continuation of prayer life. There was no ordination, and communion came from priests who had to come to visit them. The admission was rough, so somebody who wanted to join this group had to wait for about 1 year outside the walls, and by this show his commitment and his determination to join this group. So after 1 year, then he was admitted to join this community of Pachomius. Then this was Egypt, and then further north, this type of lifestyle spread. It's unclear how it did, but more and more monasteries appeared in the Near East, in Palestine, Syria, Asia Minor, and eventually in Greece. It followed the general pattern that was set in Egypt, and that means solitary anchorite pioneers were followed by more organized forms. There were also extremists, as everywhere. There are people who take it to the top. in this case, literally, taking it to the edges. There were, some masters who had iron chains attached to their legs, or were carrying heavy load of iron, or they lived in cells that were so low that they lived doubled up. One anchorite spent 10 years in a cage shaped like a wheel. The dendrites perched in trees, somewhere in hollow trees. Grazers, these were men who wandered naked in forests and fields and ate like animals, sometimes stood motionless for long periods. The Stylites, the most famous of him, is lived on top of columns. This is Simon Stylite. He is the pioneer of that. He spent 30 years on top of a pillar outside of Antioch and prayed and preached to travelers and pilgrims. This pillar became gradually higher. It started around 5 meters in height and ended up to be around 25 meters. So on this platform, and they were on this platform, he was performing different exercises. For instance, staying all day on one leg, doing his adorations, doing bowing of 1,244 times in a day. At his death, 600 soldiers came to protect his body. Yeah. What is like a portraits of this life they were living. Apart from this extreme outbursts, there were also innovations and advances in monastic life. Most notably is Basil of Caesarea, who actually is known to be the father of Eastern monasticism, which shaped the orthodoxy and the Greek monasticism until today. Yeah. And two important new emphases were added. First, social purpose, and next, an ascetical theology. Yeah. So the social purpose was that they were encouraged to situate themselves at the edges of cities, so where they were available for help, where they could serve the dwellers, the city dwellers, and enable them to do offerings and offer themselves. So they were giving examples and instructions. They were kind to travelers, gave them food, caring for the sick and needy. So this is actually that they showed the true ethics of Christianity. Yeah. So this ascetical theology then developed along with the fellow Cappadocian fathers, the Gregory of Nazianzus and Gregory of Nyssa, two of the church fathers. So this served as a theological framework to map the soul's progress from baptism to its fulfillment in the contemplative knowledge of God. So the soul should, made ready to become the bride of Christ. And also to frame it, to giving a guiding line, there was also, like a catalog of deadly sins for which one should repent or avoid to do, even better. There were 7 deadly sins, which is pride, envy, anger, greed, sadness, loss, laziness. Perhaps we would say today depression, gluttony, lust. These were the deadly sins. And the biblical basis of this were in John 5:16-17. If anyone sees his brother sinning, if the sin is not deadly, he should pray to God and he will give him life. This is only for those whose sin is not deadly. There is such a thing as deadly sin, about which I do not say that you should pray. All wrongdoing is sin, but there is sin that is not deadly. So a mortal sin, as distinct from a venial sin, must meet all of the following conditions. Its subject must be a grave one, a serious matter. It must be committed with full knowledge, both of the sin and of the gravity of the offense. It must be committed with deliberate and complete consent. It requires absolution and penance for forgiveness. The final phase of monasticism then was developing in the western part of Europe, and it became even more practical. It did not seek so much to punish the body just for the purpose of renunciation, but train it for a mission in the world. So it became like a school. It was also not a place, solitude as the highest idea, but from the beginning sought ways to organize communities. And it was very concerned about not to live in tension with the hierarchy of the church, as was it a tendency in the East. Most notably in the West, or the first maybe to know about is in the West, is Martin of Tours. He was a hermit bishop. He was a soldier, like so many great men, like also the Jesuit founder before. They were soldiers and then became heavenly soldiers. So interesting background. So Martin was a soldier, and when he saw a beggar, he gave half of his military cloak to the beggar. And the next night he had a dream where Jesus appeared to him in this half cloak and thanked him for that. And he felt so inspired that he changed his life and turned to become a monk. Augustine of Hippo was not only a renowned theologian, but he also organized a community of clergy living together in a sort of monastic setting, laying the groundwork for what would later be known as the Augustine monasticism. So their life exemplified a blend of contemplation and active service that shaped early Christian monastic tradition. Benedict of Nursia is an order that still exists today and is perhaps the oldest and maybe one of the most prestigious orders in history. Benedict was born 480 in Nursia. He is called the father of Western monasticism, and he followed a pattern of first being a hermit and then establishing a monastic community. Yeah, he had a temptation when he was in a cave. I will read this to you. The evil spirit recalled to his mind a woman he had once seen, and before he realized it, his emotions were carrying him away. Almost overcome in the struggle, he was on the point of abandoning the lonely wilderness when suddenly, with the help of God's grace, he came to himself. He noticed a thick patch of nettles and briars next to him. Throwing his garment aside, he flung himself naked into the sharp thorns and stinging nettles. There he rolled and tossed until his body was in pain and covered with blood, so complete as his triumph that from then on, as he later told his disciples, he never experiences another temptation of this kind. So those of us who have the so-called chapter 2 temptation, bring this maybe example to your mind. I'm not saying you should do that, but his testimony is it works. So, and taking the seriousness of chapter 2 issues into mind, as our founders pointing it out in their guidance, this is a way maybe to overcome it without dying. Yeah. He emerged as a holy man and established a famous monastic foundation at Monte Cassino in Italy, on the site of a former pagan grove. And he became the basics of the Western monasticism. It was exercised strict discipline, but not undue harshness. So the Benedictines have 2 meals a day. In my home also, we follow that way, but not because of religious practice, just because of health reasons, I must admit. So at times they had fresh fruits, vegetables, and a moderate amount of wine, a cover, a pillow for the bed. They insisted on permanence. What does it mean? Insist on permanence means that they sought for stability. So the surrounding a monk should experience from beginning to the end is that, you know, this network remains the same, and meaningful relationships should be established until the end of his life that support his spiritual journey. Community life also was important, so that they could grow together in faith and practice and overcome challenges together. So communal prayer, work, and shared experiences. So they share their difficulties in their life. And spiritual growth also was set as a goal. And for that, the stability again was important to develop a spiritual, to develop into spirituality. Yeah. And yeah, to be there without distractions or changes. Also, they invested in conflict resolutions when there was difficulties in the community. They were fostering patience and forgiveness. So this was strengthened the bonds and enhanced the community to unite. Then, as a stable community, they aim to witness to the world. Yeah, by their example and loyalty and exemplifying the values of the Gospels. So that was the insistence of permanence. The admonishment also was a kind of a rule. The purpose was as a correctional guidance. Yeah? So that it should help the monk to grow in virtue, deepen his spiritual life, and remain accountable in the community. Respectful approach was emphasized, so they should not, when they meet every day, every hour, they should not slow down in their respect for each other. They had a hierarchy which should be respected, and the role of the abbot was to firmly balance compassion and guiding the community and answering to the individual needs. It was also fostering the humility So to cultivate restraint, accepting the correction when someone saw something not nice, in order for the person to grow, and reinforcing by this the idea that no one is above the community's mutual accountability. And also there were, borders set. So when you did not follow 3 times, then you had to leave the monastery even for a while. And when you had been kicked out 3 times, after the 3rd time, you were not allowed anymore to return. Yeah. So this these rules were not something written for heroes of the desert, but for fallible human beings. Yeah. There's 3 principal occupations, which is prayer, the manual labor in the fields, and lectio divina, the meditative study of scripture. And I'm sure when you read, many of you who see this will feel reminded of our 40-day workshops in Chongpyeong. They gathered 8 times a day, 7 times in the daytime, and 1 time in the middle of the night. And the biblical basis is the Psalm 119. 7 times a day I praise you for your righteous laws. All psalms were recited and sung in course of a week. Yeah. So these were how they named the different time of prayer, the matins during the night, also called vigils of nocturnes, the lauds, dawn prayer around 3 o'clock in the morning, the prime early morning prayer about 6 o'clock, the terce mid-morning prayer about 9 o'clock, the sexth, the midday prayer around 12 noon, at 12 noon, and mid-afternoon prayer, it was about 3 p.m., the vesper, the evening prayer, when the lamps were lightened at 6 p.m., then the combined the night prayer before retiring at 9 p.m. So there were 4 moments of the feasting on the word. The lectio means taking a bite of reading the scripture passage slowly and attentively. So it was not important the quantity in reading, but the quality in digesting the word that one were reading. Yeah. And then meditating about it, thinking in the Spirit's presence about a text. And the oratio, savoring the essence and opening the heart to God through intuitive dialogue. And then the contemplatio, digesting the word, making it part of the body, and become joyful and wordless rest in God's presence. Then they were integrating with society and church. So church leaders incorporated monastic ideals and practices into cathedrals and different parts of the country. Monastic schools fulfilled an important educational function, became the primary centers of learning in Europe. I think the first libraries there were built in monasteries. Monasteries also had a profound economic impact, for many were established on marginal lands that were brought into production by the labor of monks. Yeah. The link to the papacy that is important is that when Monte Cassino was attacked by the Lombards, the Benedictinians had to flee, and they went to Rome and came under the influence of Pope Gregory, who later became Pope, and he used them as missionaries and as ambassadors. So 40 of them were sent to England to Christianize the British Isle, and from there the famous bishop of the Germans came out, Boniface. Later it played a major role in linking the papacy with the Franks. And with the support of the papacy, the Benedictine rule became dominant in the Western Church. Thank you for your attending, and I hope it could give you some inspiration and some background and some foundation to understand that our life of faith that we practice also in our unification movement has actually a history, and that we are not doing something completely new or out of the nothing. That what Father and Mother Moon are teaching us in these days has actually a foundation in history. Thank you so much. With this, I will close.